Welcome. We're glad that you've joined us today for this webinar on the draft Sustainable Use of Resources Criteria for the EPEAT Ecolabel. I'm Patty Dillon, Senior Director of Criteria and Category Development at GEC. Last week, GEC released its draft criteria on sustainable use of resources for a 60-day public comment period. On today's webinar, we're really excited to share with you an overview of the draft criteria, as well as some of the rationale behind the criteria. We'll also give a quick tutorial on how to submit comments, if that's of interest to you, and answer any questions you have about the criteria and comment process. Before we get started, just a few quick logistics items. First, the webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available following the webinar. Please feel free to share it with your colleagues. It's public information. We'll also make a copy of the slide deck available. Again, feel free to share it. Everybody is on mute today to reduce noise. We're going to use the questions panel in your dashboard. So if you have any questions, open up that window on your dashboard and type in your question. You can type them in as we go along. We will actually wait to the end of the presentation before we start addressing questions, just so we make sure we get through the content. If we don't get to address your question today on the webinar live, we will respond after the webinar via email. So joining me today, okay, it's not, okay, there we go, a little bit of lag, sorry. Joining me on today's call are Erica Logan. Erica is the Director of Sustainability Criteria Development at GEC. She's the project lead for developing the criteria for sustainability impact modules, including the sustainable use of resources. Erica has been with GEC for almost 2 years now. And before coming to GEC, she worked for over 20 years in industry in various environmental health, safety, and sustainability capacities. We're also pleased to have with us on today's webinar NSF International. NSF is GEC's partner in developing criteria for the sustainability impact modules. Jess Evans is with us today. Jess is the Director of Standards Development at NSF. She oversees all the NSF standards development efforts. Her team facilitates the development and maintenance of more than 80 NSF ANSI standards and approximately 70 additional protocols in the areas of food, water, safety, and sustainability. Greta Barriger is also with us today. She's the Sustainability Standards Lead at NSF, and she's actually working with GEC on all of the sustainability impact modules. Prior to joining NSF, Greta worked as a sustainability analyst at Steelcase. So with that, let's quickly look at the agenda for today's call. We will give a quick overview of the GEC criteria development process for those of you who are not familiar with it or need a refresh. Then we'll move into providing highlights of our state of sustainability research on sustainable use of resources, quite a mouthful. This will basically talk about some of the science behind the criteria. We'll provide, most of the call will be spent on an overview of the draft criteria, and then we'll move into a quick tutorial on the public comment process, what are the next steps, and then finally open it up to questions and answers. So let's get started. So first, I just wanted to, before we get into the draft criteria and the science, I wanted to provide a quick overview of GEC's new criteria development process, which we are using to develop criteria for the EPEAT program. I wanted to highlight two fundamental changes in our process that are important context for the draft criteria that we'll be reviewing today. Now, the EPEAT program, as many of you know, launched in 2006 with just one product category, computers and displays. And we've now grown to over 7 product categories. 6 of them are in the ICT space, and then we have our new photovoltaic modules. Currently, each product category has its own set of criteria, its own revision cycle, which is inefficient for all stakeholders, whether it's when participating in criteria development and maintenance, or if you're a participating manufacturer or even GEC or a conformity assurance body, and you're working to meet and to verify criteria. So in GEC's new criteria development process, we essentially are creating horizontal criteria that are focused on priority sustainability impacts. These modules will apply across all EP product categories, starting with our ICT product categories. There are 4 sustainability impact modules as shown here. We have climate change mitigation shown on the top left in green. That covers things like carbon footprint and energy efficiency in manufacturing processes, as well as product energy efficiency, renewable energy, etc. And going clockwise, our sustainability use of resources or circularity, that's in blue. That's the subject of today's webinar, so I won't say anything more about that because we'll have a lot of time to discuss it throughout the webinar. Then shown in purple in the bottom right is our corporate ESG performance. Our initial focus in this module will be the S in ESG, including labor and occupational health and safety performance in the supply chain, responsible mineral sourcing, etc. And then finally, in red there is the reduction of chemicals of concern. Each of these modules is a separate criteria development process. Each of the modules will be developed using this new criteria development process. EPEAT is now a recognized Type 1 eco-label. So this new process was designed to align with the requirements of ISO 1424 for Type 1 eco-labels and to maintain GEC's commitment to developing criteria within a voluntary consensus process, which we know is very important to our stakeholders. So the process starts on the left with a State of Sustainability Research Report. This lays out the science and evidence to support criteria development. The research looks at the sustainability impacts across the life cycle of the product, and then looks at what kind of strategies and best practices there are to mitigate those identified impacts. And this all leads to recommendations for criteria. The State of Sustainability Research is open for 60 days for public comment, and then it's revised based on the comments or additional data received, and then we publish the report. So the sustainable use of resources for this module we're talking about today, the State of Sustainability Research went out for public consultation last fall, and the final version, which is shown here, was published in November of 2021. It's available on the GEC website. And in a few minutes, Erica will give some highlights from the research, but I really encourage you to read the report as it does contain a wealth of information. And then based on the impacts and mitigation strategies that are identified in the State of Sustainability Research, criteria drafting begins. Now, the draft criteria can originate from different sources, including we love to leverage existing EPEAT criteria if they're available, and also if they represent leadership. GEC staff or partner organizations may draft criteria. And we also welcome submissions from stakeholders. In fact, we have gotten in our climate change module, we did indeed have a criteria that was submitted by stakeholders, and it went through this process and is now in the draft criteria document. So after we draft the criteria, or kind of concurrently, GEC puts out a call for participation and forms expert ad hoc groups. These are a group of experts that provide technical feedback on the draft criteria. Many of you on the call today might be participating in these expert ad hoc groups. They also may draft additional criteria. For the Sustainable Use of Resources module, we had 8 expert ad hoc groups working on different criteria topics. And the topics basically for the expert ad hocs pretty much align with the sections of the criteria document that you'll see that you have access to. And then after the expert ad hoc groups are done with their work, GEC compiles all of the criteria from the different ad hoc groups into one full criteria document. Excuse me. It's essentially a standard. And this is delivered to a technical committee. The technical committee is the voluntary consensus body that deliberates on the criteria. They modify the criteria as they progress through the discussions and ultimately are responsible for approving criteria by consensus. Now, at this point in time, the draft criteria are also made available for public comment, and that's where we are in the process for sustainable use of resources. We released this draft last week. Then the final step in the process is to actually have EPEAT implement the criteria. So EPEAT adopts the criteria that come out of the voluntary consensus process, in the case of the sustainability impact modules, it will be a compilation of all the criteria from the modules that we required for to register to qualify for EPEAT status. If you want a deeper dive into the process, there's a link there that you can actually look at the process details. One of the things I wanted to just show, this is in the document as well, is when you're commenting, looking at the criteria, criteria are basically supposed to address these various principles for criteria development. So quickly looking at them, one, criteria should address priority sustainability impacts as identified in the State of Sustainability Research, and they should address life cycle impacts. Criteria should be leadership, so required criteria should be leadership, and then we also incentivize continuous improvement and innovation through use of optional criteria. The criteria should represent leadership and current best practices, recognizing that the ability of the market to meet the criteria might, take place over time. The number 4 criteria should differentiate products in the marketplace. 5, criteria should align with international leadership best practices. This could be regulations, standards, voluntary programs, etc., but should not impact international trade. And finally, number 6, we want to make sure the criteria are verifiable. So one last comment before I turn it over to Erica, and that is we always get questions on the implementation of the modules. So I just wanted to quickly share this with you. So we have divided the implementation of the impact modules into 2 phases. The first phase, we will simultaneously roll out all 4 sustainability impact modules across the EPEAT ICT product categories that were launched prior to 2020. So that includes the ones listed here, the 5 categories of ICT. It's just not inclusive of network equipment. We also will be putting not this module, but some of the other modules will be applied to our new wearables category as well. Then in phase 2, which is network equipment and possibly photovoltaics, we will do those after 2024. So this is just a quick view of what phase 1 implementation would look like. And the most important thing is that once the modules are implemented in EPEAT, manufacturers basically have 12-month transition period when they can either be conforming with the existing criteria in each product category or using the new impact modules. If you have any questions about this, please ask, contact us. I know it was really quick. So with this, I'd like to turn it over to Erica, who will dive into the state of sustainability research and criteria. Erica?
Great, thank you so much. Next slide, let's see. Yeah, I'm getting something that says show my screen. Can you show your screen?
Let's see, technical,
I can bring up a copy of the presentation, but
excuse me one second. Let me change it real quick.
Okay. Okay, terrific. Let's dive in. So next slide. So I'd like to start off by introducing the subject and the topic, and starting off with why must we do more? And wanted to share a couple studies here, as to why in an increasingly digital world, circularity has never been more important. Per 2017 IEA digitalization report, more than 3.5 billion people, or nearly half the global population, now uses the internet, up from 500 million in 2001, and that was 2017. So I'm sure it's significantly grown since then. And I found this hard to believe, but apparently there are more mobile phone subscriptions, 7.7 billion, than people in the world. This is absolutely amazing and tremendous. And to access the internet, we need servers and data centers. We need networking equipment, computers, mobile phones, imaging equipment to communicate and share. And the opportunity for bridging the digital divide and enabling broader access to education, to energy, to healthcare, and the list goes on, is just tremendous. At the same time, per a UN 2020 Global E-Waste Monitor report, e-waste is the fastest growing waste stream globally. We used to say it was one of the fastest. According to this report, it is the fastest. And so as I put on this slide, there are significant implications for the sustainable use of resources, or circularity, to produce these electronic devices upon which the world depends, along with inextricable links for the health of people and the stability of our climate. So with that, setting the stage, let's dive in. Next slide, please. So I wanted to present you with a very high-level overview of a few key takeaways from our state of sustainability research. But as Patty said, I really highly encourage you to go to the link on our website, download it, and read through the whole document. There's just a tremendous wealth of information here. So our research evaluated impacts across the life cycle of electronic products, from upstream and downstream. And here are some of the key takeaways. So metals and plastics are the most significant contributors by mass. Resources, especially energy and water, are required across the life cycle, but in particular for raw material extraction and production. Valuable resources are lost, if not recovered, at end of life, which just leads to more and more raw material extraction. And of course, we appreciate that there are interlinkages between sustainable use of resources and toxics, whether we're talking about upstream mining operations, to hindering of material recovery downstream due to contamination with certain flame retardants. And of course, there are additional interlinkages between circularity and climate, due in large part to greenhouse gas emissions associated with energy use. And just to take a note to explain, how we're addressing these various impacts, We're working to address chemical restrictions and alternatives assessment via our chemicals of concern module. That was one of those boxes Patty showed on that slide there with the 4 impact areas. And then we're working to address GHG inventories and climate-specific strategies in our climate change mitigation module. So in short, I'd like to say, that we truly need sound chemicals management to enable circularity, and circularity to enable climate mitigation. It's all very much interlinked. Next slide, please. So this graphic, which I really like, it attempts to simplify what is a very complicated subject, into just one slide. And you'll see considerations from upstream material selection and water management to many strategies aimed ultimately in keeping products in service for as long as possible, whether it's through design, it's access to repair, secure data deletion, and so forth. And I hope you can't hear this, this dog that's adjacent to me trying to play tug of war here and being distracting. So please, I hope you can't hear that, but please ignore that if you can. So continuing on. And when products do finally reach end of life, recovering valuable materials to serve as the feedstock for the next generation of products. And as we review the draft criteria, which we'll do next, we'll essentially be taking a deep dive into all of these mitigation strategies, as we discuss ways to incentivize and measure these various aspects. So, thank you. And proceeding. All right, so let's pivot from there to diving into the criteria itself. And before getting into those details, I wanted to start off with just kind of an EPEAT 101 slide. I imagine many of you on the phone have worked with EPEAT for a very long time and you understand kind of how it's functioned, but for some of you, it may be new. And you're gonna hear us talk a lot about required criteria and optional criteria. And so I just wanted to make sure we all started off with a common understanding. And so EPEAT is a tiered eco-label. It's intended to spur innovation and move markets. For a product to get even onto the EPEAT registry, it must meet all of the required criteria. And for products to be considered silver, they must meet at least 50% of the optional criteria on top of meeting all of the required. And similarly, for a product to be considered gold, it must meet all of the required plus 75% of the optional criteria across the 4 sustainability impact modules. So once again, keep that in mind as we talk through the draft criteria and the required setting a minimum baseline expectation for sustainable products, and the silver and gold moving us even further and beyond that. Next slide. One up, yeah, here we go. So before we dive into a lot of detail, I'd like to kind of give everyone a bigger picture of what's in this sustainability impact module. So we've organized things into 10 separate buckets. There are 35 proposed criteria, 20 are required, 15 are optional. You'll note that approximately 9 of the criteria or so are materials focused, and 17 are product longevity, design, repair. So heavy emphasis on materials and design, which you would expect. Would also like to share that we had nearly 80 experts contribute to the initial drafting of this criteria from all different stakeholder categories, which was great. And so from here, what I'd like to do is walk through each of these main criteria sections I'm going to highlight the items that are either new or slightly different from what you've seen in the past. I'll also highlight some items where there was a lot of discussion among the expert ad hoc participants. But please note that for the sake of time, I will not cover every single item on every slide. However, we will make the slides available on the website separate from the recording. So if you just want to download the slides as a reference without having to listen to the whole recording again, you will be able to do so. Okay, and then, one other quick note too, just around organization. Yes, critical minerals and rare earths is a subset of materials. There is overlap between product longevity and designing for repair and reuse. And could we have, bucketed these things a little bit differently? Of course. We did it this way partly just to aid in for readability and when you're trying to find certain topics. So with that, okay, let's go ahead. Next slide. And let's dive in. Okay, so starting off with material selection. You'll notice here 3 required, 2 optional. This is largely addressing about post-consumer recycled content for both metals and plastics. What's new to EPEAT is criteria for recycled metal content. It was recommended by expert participants and supported by the State of Sustainability Research. We prioritized aluminum, magnesium, and steel. And I'd like to call your attention in particular to the presentation of 2 different options for incentivizing use of recycled content aluminum. Historically, EPEAT has specified use of recycled content without being prescriptive about how it was sourced or manufactured. In this case, expert ad hoc participants had some strong opinions that we should take this a step further. So you'll note in the draft criteria document in a blue box, there are 2 options presented for public comment related to stamping versus CNC. So these are, as it's been explained to me, these are fabrication processes. We're told CNC is inherently less efficient. It requires much more starting material and produces more waste that cannot be recycled. Stamping, on the other hand, is much more efficient, but it's also less plentiful. So if we were to set a high recycled content proposed threshold, let's say 90%, we could inadvertently increase use of the CNC process and defeat overall efficiency goals. And I have a quote here from one manufacturer. I'd like to read it so I don't mess it up here, but they said, because the initial material needed to form a part is much higher for CNC than for stamping, the material loss is much higher for CNC. In one instance, a manufacturer saw that starting weight for the CNC process was over 6 times the weight of the end product, while for stamping, it was 0.12 times greater. So this resulted in a 54% total material loss for CNC processed aluminum versus a 1% loss for stamped aluminum after scrap is utilized. And so, while the data demonstrating the trade-offs is really quite compelling, it's not in the public domain. And as you all know, transparency is a high priority for the EPEAT program. So as a result, we're presenting 2 options. One specifies a threshold of 25% recycled content, which would be achievable by utilizing either fabrication process, while the other differentiates and provides varying thresholds depending on the fabrication process used. So it's 25% for stamping, it's 75% for CNC. We very much welcome comments on this via the public consultation process. Let me move to the next slide for the sake of time. Critical minerals and rare earth elements. This section has been significantly expanded from what you've seen in past EPEAT related standards, with 4 criteria now, 1 required, 3 optional. And we had some expert ad hoc participants advise that there should be more required criteria, especially around disclosure. And we had others strongly advise that everything in this should be optional, that this is very much a new and emerging area. And so what you see proposed is really an attempt to thread that needle. And keep in mind, the goal is to also increase transparency as a means to increasing recovery. It's about knowledge, really, of how and where these materials are used. We also formed proposing 1 required criterion, but with a very limited scope, where the market has already demonstrated that this is feasible. At the same time, as this criteria starts to expand and apply to across ICT product categories, we realize the supply chains are going to need time to adapt to that as well. Next slide, please. So moving to the product longevity section, you'll note here that there is a required criterion for provisions for availability of firmware and system software. This will apply across ICT products. However, the duration for which it needs to be available will vary depending on the type of product. The remaining criteria in this section do have a more limited product scope. They're focused specifically on portable products, which would be notebook computers, tablets, and mobile phones. And this is driven really in large part due to concerns, data around short lifetimes and premature obsolescence. The criteria focus on durability, battery lifespan, and also want to point out that they do align with the EU's Green Public Procurement Program, which would allow EP to serve as another Type 1 eco-label choice. But there are a number of criteria in this particular section that do not apply to every ICT product category. They are focused on portable products. Next slide, please. Design for repair, reuse, and recycling. This section includes a new proposal for an optional criterion on software parts pairing. This too was proposed by expert ad hoc participants and supported by the State of Sustainability Research. The proposed criterion calls for product designs to enable OEM or third-party replacement parts to be fully functional upon physical installation. Or alternatively, the manufacturer can enable full functionality by providing necessary software tools. So this is all about when a component part, let's say a camera on a mobile phone, really can't be replaced by a third party because it's tied to a type of software lock. So this would be enable the repair of that device. The other criteria in this section around plastic parts really are not new to the EPEAT Eco label, but they will standardize the language across product categories. And next slide, please. Availability of repair services and information to enable repair, reuse, and recycling. So the ultimate goal of this section is to enable as many repair channels as possible. At the same time, we're striving to recognize the differences between product categories. So for example, the multifunction device in the office environment most likely has to be repaired by an authorized service provider. At the same time, for some of the portable products, there's maybe opportunity to enable more repair channels. It establishes an expectation to offer repair services and replacement parts. This was a significant point of discussion in our expert ad hoc groups, with manufacturers being concerned that they're going to have to maintain parts inventories for things that they don't need and just end up contributing to the waste stream. Well, with purchasers being very concerned that the products they purchase will be repaired and spare parts will be available, and that you won't just wholesale throw out the device and replace the whole thing. It'll be repaired. And so once again, an attempt to thread that needle by specifying a minimum list of repair parts, aligns with some EU GPP guidelines, but then also allows manufacturers to determine what parts they may need based on component failure rate data and a history of the types of parts that historically have been needed. And then finally, this section also adds some disclosure provisions, which are aimed at increasing transparency and purchaser choice. Next slide, please. Secure data deletion. So this is one criterion, but a very important one. And I always like to summarize it as saying it's really all about trust. Because purchasers, and that's all of us, it's you and I too, lack trust that our personal data is going to be properly handled and protected, we may often specify some very destructive methods, which ultimately end up preventing reuse of the component part, and even recovery of some substances such as critical minerals and the subset rare earths. And so what this criterion really strives to do is to put the tools and the knowledge needed for secure data deletion in the hands of purchasers, ultimately about increasing their confidence and their trust in the protection of their data. And of course, welcome comments on this proposed criterion. Next slide, please. Responsible end of life. A lot of this will look very familiar to EPEAT veterans out there. It maintains EPEAT's long-standing commitment to requiring access to take back and assurance of responsible end of life processing, wherever in the world EPEAT products are registered. And one thing I wanted to point out, as you're thinking about your comments on this, is there is one thing that is not here, and wanted to explain why. And I'll emphasize it's not here yet, and that is recognition of waste compensation models as a means to increasing capacity for developing markets. This is something we wanted very much to do. Our primary barrier was a lack currently of acceptable third-party verification mechanisms for an entity we were referring to as the waste compensation service provider. We also lack some internationally recognized consistent definitions for terms that tend to be used in this space, such as waste neutral. But there's work is continuing on this topic in various fora, including the Circular Electronics Partnership. And EPEAT certainly does intend to return to this important topic in the future. Next slide, please. Packaging. So you'll note here that the proposed criteria are focused on rewarding sustainable material choices and designs that enable recovery. I want to point out, draw your attention to the definition for packaging here, which is it applies to sales or primary packaging, and definitely does not include pallet. So keep that in mind as you read through the proposal here. Also want to call out the employment of a sustainability hierarchy, rewarding use of post-consumer recycled content, followed by the use of rapidly renewable content. And as you can imagine, we had a lot of discussion about what's rapidly renewable. How do we define it? How do we measure it? And we put forth a proposal, but we certainly welcome your comments and your feedback through the public consultation process. How am I doing on time? Have a couple more minutes. Okay, next slide, please. So the last two criteria in this section are our upstream supply chain focused criteria, one for water and one for waste. The water criterion seeks to incentivize water management, both quantity and quality. And it's proposed to focus further upstream in the electronic supply chain, namely printed circuit board and chip manufacturing, where the impacts are greatest. Setting aside mining, which is a whole other set of challenges in terms of trying to develop an inventory. It's as a place to start, we felt printed circuit board manufacturing and chip manufacturing was more tenable. And then next slide, please. And then finally, for reducing supply chain manufacturing waste, here we're really working to strive towards zero waste to landfill at every part of the upstream supply chain. There's opportunities from final assembly all the way further back, of course, to chip manufacturing. And one thing I wanted to point out here in particular is that the definitions of hazardous versus non-hazardous in these zero waste manufacturing schemes, they align with local laws and regulations. So it's noting that there may be some differences from one market to another. They're also cognizant of the fact that if it's a hazardous waste and that it elicits a certain hazardous characteristic, that it must be handled separately and it must be sent to a permitted landfill facility. So often the minimum of 90% diversion of waste from landfill will exclude hazardous. Having said that, in some countries, batteries, for example, right? Lithium-ion batteries, at least in the US, are considered universal waste. And we want to be sure that we're taking every step possible to recover those as well and divert from landfill. So yes, there are going to be some differences from country to country based on how that is defined. And last slide. Wanted to take a minute just to explain some changes in terminology. So this applies across the board to all the criteria. For those of you who have been working for EPEAT with EPEAT a long time, we used to refer to corporate criteria and product criteria. We're now trying to add another level of specificity, and you will note that at the start of each verification section, it will say this criterion is verified at the product level, or it is verified at the product category level. And to hopefully avoid a few comments in this area, wanted to just explain quickly what we mean by that. So if it says evidence is required at the product level, it means it's required for each and every product on the category. So an example might be disclosure of post-consumer recycled plastic content. That needs to be disclosed for each product on the registry. If it says this product is verified at the product category level, this says that you can demonstrate what let's say your take-back systems are for your computers and displays products. And perhaps you have a different take-back system that you want to describe for your server products. Or maybe you handle this the same way across your company, regardless of the products, then you can check that box. But it allows a little bit of flexibility that says for all of my computer products on the registry, here's my take-back program. For all my server products, here's my take-back program, or I do it the same way across. And then There's one third category, which is this product, this criterion is verified at the corporation level. We actually didn't identify any where this applies in the sustainable use of resources module. But what this says, and it should be used on a limited basis, but it says that the verification evidence needs to be provided for each product category on the registry in the same way. So it removes that flexibility where maybe you source things for one part of your business one way versus another. One example is in our climate change mitigation module in relation to the science-based technology or science-based targets initiative, rather SBTI. You have to apply the methodology in the same way across your product categories. So it's designated as being at the corporation level. But like I said, we didn't identify any where that's necessary within the sustainable uses of criteria module. So I hope that's helpful as you're reading through the draft criteria. And with that, let me turn it back to Patty and Greta.
All right, thank you, Erica. I am going to start us off on providing an overview of the public comment process, and I'm going to turn it over to Greta. So the public commenting piece of this project will be facilitated and take place on the NSF online workspace. The participation in the process is open to all interested parties and persons who are directly and materially affected by the criteria that will be reviewed. As Erica and Patty both mentioned, the 60-day public comment period has launched last week on May 19th and will run until July 18th. This portion of the public commenting period runs concurrently with the technical review and balloting period process. And at the end of this 60-day window, all of the comments will be compiled and it will formulate the discussion and put together the discussion topics for the technical group in the weeks ahead. Once the technical committee has worked through all of the comments, there will be a final summary and of the comments that were received and the actions that were taken, and that will be publicly available as well once that entire process has been completed. And all of the commenters that submit feedback will be responded to individually, and it will be consistent with the action that is reflected in that final report. An important distinction and clarification here is any comment that is put on the site is attributed to that individual. And so there is a portion that Greta will be going over where your contact information will be included in the comment. Once you receive this deck after today's call, the link on this slide will take you right to the spot for you to submit your feedback. So we look forward to involving all of those interested in submitting feedback. Thank you. Greta, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jess. And like Jess said, I want to just get into the weeds here a little bit and show you, as you follow that link, the page that you'll show up on and how to work through the commenting function on the NSF online workspace. So if you follow the link from the previous slide, you'll land here. This is where the document is available. So you can download the PDF version of the full draft criteria document. There's also a description that covers the instructions I'm going to walk through today. So you can reference that if you have questions, or of course, reach out to me as well. So you'll want to follow the small link in the top left here to add a comment, and that will take you to this next page. So to start off, just some basic personal information that will be required. It's denoted by the asterisk which is typical. And so that's how we'll track who submitted comments, ask for follow-ups as well. as you progress down the page, you'll get into the weeds of the content here. So some required fields, the subject of your comment, and then your specific comment. There's also the possibility to submit and add additional specification of where your comment is. You can get down to the specific line as well. It's helpful for us if you include that, but I know that there are multitudes of comments that people want to submit in any given criterion or section. So if you want to do it that way, please feel free to batch comments in this page. You don't have to submit them by specific individual comments if you are commenting down to the line and things like that. So feel free to group by criterion or by section, and you can specify that in the subject line. One section here I want to point out that isn't required to submit a comment, but it's vital to the process, is this field down here to include a proposed solution. So as you're working through and identifying things you might think need to be changed or show up a little bit different in the final criteria, it's really important to us to include that proposed solution and even specifics of how you'd like the language to be changed or proposed language changes. That really helps us streamline the process and, like Jess said, structure our agendas and discussion topics for the committee as we work through it. And then last thing I want to point out on this page is that you can attach supporting files here. So if there's a study or any content you want to provide in relation to your comment, you can add it there as well. And then you'll just slide to enable the save function here, and then you can progress through by saving and adding another. Oops, sorry. And then, oops, I don't want to progress. Okay, there we go. Save and add another, or just save the comment and keep working through. So I wanted to walk through that. If you have questions as you work on it, please don't hesitate to reach out. And then next steps here, I can cover a few of these. So just another reminder, public comment process is open for 60 days. So from July 19 to, May 19 to July 18, comments are due at midnight or 11:59 p.m. on July 18th. You'll submit comments through the online platform, so an additional link there. And then we just wanted to link the draft criteria and the state of sustainability research as well for your reference. So questions about consensus process and how to submit comments can come to me. Questions about GEC's process and developing the criteria should go to that criteria at globalelectronicscouncil.org. And I'll turn it back to Patty.
Great, thank you, Erica, Jess, and Greta. So now we'll actually field some questions. If you have a question, again, type it into the questions panel on your GoToWebinar dashboard. We'll get to as many as we can. If we don't get to your question, we will follow up with an email response. So let's see, I have a few questions that have come in. So the first is, let's see, what's the process for evaluating comments that come in, and could you clarify the role of the technical committee? Jess, is that something that you can answer for us?
Yes, absolutely. So as I had mentioned, the comments that we receive both from the technical committee and the public commenters will all be compiled and will be discussed by the technical committee. And so those responses and actions will be determined by the technical committee, and then NSF will facilitate the next steps in communicating and getting those responses out to the commenters.
Great, thanks, Jess. Another question is, let's see, is the 60-day public comment period only for the sustainable use of resources or all 4 sections? So I'm assuming the reference to all 4 sections is all 4 modules. So Jess, do you want to, or Greta, either respond to that?
Yeah, I can answer that one. So Since we're progressing through this in modules, there's a technical committee that's active for each of those 4 modules that we saw on Patty's slide. So this 60-day public comment period is just for the sustainable use of resources draft criteria document. Climate change has already progressed through theirs. And then as we progress through the summer, we'll launch the other 2. And you'll be notified of those comment periods as well.
Great, thank you, Greta. And there's actually a sort of somewhat of a parallel question, and I'll actually field this one, and that is whether there'll be a public comment period when the criteria in all 4 modules is complete. For example, to allow the balancing of optional points among modules. So I'll answer this because this is actually as Greta said, each of the sustainability impact modules is a separate voluntary consensus process. It has a separate technical committee. So there are, EPEAT is actually committed to implementing the criteria that have been approved in each voluntary consensus process, and does not plan on having another voluntary consensus process that's looking at all of the criteria across all 4 modules. So the answer is no. What's coming out of each of the voluntary consensus processes will be implemented by EPEAT as they come out. There's another question here about the link to the slides. So in the after the webinar today, everybody on the call, as well as anybody signed up, will receive a follow-up email, and that will include the link to the slides, link to the NSF Workspace for comments, link to everything that's been referenced here today. So another okay, so there's a question here about whether once the 4 modules are finalized and published, will manufacturers have the option to either register their modules to the, excuse me, it says modules, I'm assuming their products, to the new modules or to the present standard. So in response to that, I'll actually field that quickly because I covered it on a slide, but very quickly. There is a 12-month transition period. Once these new criteria in the 4 modules are implemented by EPEAT, manufacturers will have up to 12 months to transition to the new criteria. So what that means is after the launch of the public registry, some manufacturers might choose to continue to register products to the existing criteria, or they can start to register to the new criteria. There'll be a 12-month transition period. At the end of the 12 months, all the products that are registered to the existing product criteria, they will actually sunset, and only products that meet the new criteria will be maintained on the EPEAT platform. So can one submit information that is confidential without making it public? So the answer to that, Jess, do you want to answer that? So can somebody, I guess the question is, can someone submit confidential comments without making them public?
So I actually think that there might be 2 interpretations here. So the first being confidential comments is something that we do like to avoid, just because this process is open and transparent, and we need to satisfy the requirements that we've laid forward in our policies and procedures. Confidential information. So for example, if you are submitting a comment and your supporting documentation is confidential information, I think that's something that we want to discuss on a case-by-case basis, because in our process, this is something that is taken under consideration, and we'll go through the activity of masking the identity and some of the sensitive material within that data, and still share that with the technical committee for full consideration. But I would recommend, if that is the case, if you want to submit a comment with sensitive information to support your comment, I would reach out directly to Greta, and we will help you navigate that situation.
Great, thanks, Jess, for clarifying that there could be two different types of confidentiality that people are looking at. So a question here about, will manufacturers have to go through desk review? That's actually, yes, the same type of process that applies currently would be applicable to the new criteria. I did forget to mention when I presented my slides that the EPEAT program will be undertaking some stakeholder meetings to get feedback on various aspects of the implementation of the modules. And so I would encourage you to attend. That's the kind of information on the actual implementation that would be covered there. So with that, I know I have a few questions that we didn't get to, but it is the top of the hour. So if we will respond to any remaining questions that we get, we will respond to those via email. So with that, I would like to, in closing, thank everyone for attending the webinar. Thank you very much for Erica, Jess, and Greta for your participation. And again, later today, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to today's webinar recording, a link to the PowerPoint presentation, as well as a link to the NSF online platform that has the draft criteria and the state of sustainability research. So with that, thanks again for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day. Bye now.
Take care.